That's a fair assessment. Man, all right, I gotta concede.
Okay.
This isn't really a topic that I discussed too
It's okay.
much, but it was a
No problem.
Andrew Wilson takes on two separate challengers and skillfully breaks down the flawed logic behind secular supremacy in politics. Andrew Wilson argues with clarity and confidence that Christians have just as much right to shape law and policy as secularists do, and he doesn't back down. Through logic, real-world examples, and firm moral grounding, Andrew Wilson flips the conversation and exposes the double standards surrounding separation of church and state. Let's walk through some key moments where Andrew Wilson takes full control.
Pleasure.
There we go. All right, so Christians have as much a right to rule as secular people.
Correct.
Um,
So
Yeah,
just to kind of let me flesh it out a little bit for you very briefly.
Yeah.
So the idea is secularists say that only they seem to be able to have the power to push political authority. I push back against that idea and say no, Christians also should be allowed to push political authority. And just because you're a secularist, it doesn't give you any additional right to have authority than a Christian does. So this idea of separation of church and state actually doesn't make a lot of sense to me, because if Christians can push political authority, as is their right, then it seems that you're going to have Christians who are in the government and they are going to be ruling from their moral stance.
Okay, yeah, and I don't actually entirely disagree with this. I would say, though, when we're talking about Christians in authority, I think that usually what they're talking about, or the criticism, is less so that they're Christian and more so that they're operating under a dogmatic ideology. And so under that concept, like, do you think it's okay for people to use dogmas in a political sense?
Like the Constitution, like that kind of dogma?
Why would the Constitution be dogmatic?
Well, what is a dogma? Let's start with that.
A dogma is an appeal to some sort of unchanging authority.
Is that what you think it is?
I believe it is.
Yeah, so let's look at this idea. We'll kind of flesh it out a little bit here. I think that it's fine. By the way, that I'm not sure that the Constitution is able to be changed in certain parts of it, right? Or it stops becoming the Constitution. But I think the idea of what we have in America is dogmatic. The idea of, well, only secularists have the ability to rule because we have to separate out religious authority, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think that we do need to separate out religious authority. I don't even think we can. And so if politicians are going to rule from a moral stance, what's going to inform their morals? Well, it's going to be their religion and their dogma.
Right.
So if my dogma is informing my morals, aren't I supposed to rule from my dogma?
Well, so...
Yeah, exactly. Andrew Wilson is just being real here. If someone's morals come from their religious beliefs, why should they pretend otherwise when they enter politics? Andrew Wilson is showing that everyone rules from some kind of moral base, whether it's religion or some secular philosophy. So, I mean, yeah, if it's okay for a secularist to do that, then Andrew Wilson is totally right that Christians should be able to as well.
I think this is kind of like you can be dogmatic without appealing to a dogma. Or you can be, I think a better way to put this, I think you can be secular as a Christian, right? So being secular, to my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is pretty much just operating outside of religious context, right? So in government, for example, I don't think the Constitution is dogmatic because, as you mentioned, it's amendable. Something like the Bible, right? If that's your point of moral authority, I think you can operate under that. We all have some sort of moral system that we're appealing to. But I think that when push comes to shove, right, if there's an issue like evolution, for example, right, that's a lot of pushback in schools right now. I don't think that you can appeal to evolution being false purely because it contradicts the Bible. I mean, you technically can, but I don't think it's justifiable. Does that make sense? Because it's non-falsifiable. You can't, if you're just going to assume that the Bible is true as your foundation, that's operating dogmatically, and I don't think we can really make progress that way.
Yeah, but that's just assertions, right? Like, let's say that Christians did. Let's say they outlawed the teaching of evolution, right? So what? What would even your argument be? If the argument is we have to outlaw prayer, we have to move prayer out, we have to move God out of schools, we have to move these things out of schools, then when Christians are in charge, why shouldn't you be surprised when they say, oh, well, we're gonna move your stuff out.
Yeah.
Now we're gonna move your nonsense out of here, right?
I agree. Like if Christians are in power, of course they have the authority to technically do whatever they want.
Yeah, but what my argument is that they have every much right. They have as much right to utilize that political power and authority as secularists do. Secularists and atheists have no leg to stand on when they say, wait a second, Christians aren't allowed to push their power. Yes, they are. If atheists are, Christians are too.
I agree. Maybe the better way to put it is they are legally allowed to. I don't know that they're, I mean, ethically you can do whatever you want as well, right? But I don't think it's ethically permissible. I think that this is unethical behavior.
What's unethical about it?
Well, so for example, right, if we're pushing out something like evolution, I think that leads to a lot of downstream effects as far as like anti-science
So does pushing
rhetoric.
out prayer.
How so?
Well, I mean, you would have to admit that when you were a kid, maybe not when you were a kid, but at least when I was a kid, we used to pledge allegiance to the flag, right?
Yes.
One nation under God. So it gives a reinforcement of patriotism, an idea of solidarity with your countrymen, right? And prayer in school also creates solidarity between people. It gives them purpose, gives them faith. There's all sorts of negative ramifications of pushing it out, right? Oh,
Wow, that goes quick. All right.
yeah, that went real quick. Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah. Go ahead.
All right. So your stance is Christians have the right to rule as much as secularists?
Yeah.
Okay. So as a Christian, I can't disagree with you too much on that. However, just because you're a Christian doesn't mean you shouldn't be in power. But what you do with your morals and values should not be portrayed in how you rule. I'm a big believer in church and state, or separation of church and state. So, there's a place for the religious aspect of your life and your upbringing and all that, but it shouldn't be brought into more of a power stance.
You can't separate church and state. Let me explain why. Have you ever elected a politician who's a Christian?
Yes.
Did you expect that when he ruled from his moral stances, which were informed by Christianity?
I would expect that he would have ruled based off of his policies, which...
What? How's he going to figure his policies out other than what he considers moral in his brain?
So, give me a second here.
Sure. Take your time.
So I feel like the specific people that I would vote for, elect, his policies would specifically be how I would feel, would not be based off of his Christian morals. And that's how I vote.
So where do you want him to find his morals? Like in the trash can, or like if you're electing a person to be who's a Christian into office, right? Where do you want him to get his information for how he's going to rule morally?
That part made me laugh a little because Andrew Wilson just hit him with a checkmate. I mean, if someone's a Christian and they get into politics, why wouldn't they base their decisions on their Christian morals? Andrew Wilson is just being honest about how morality works. Like, yeah, you can't separate someone's values from how they lead. And Andrew Wilson is not afraid to say that straight up.
If you're a Christian and you point to some other stance and say that's more moral than my stance, then why are you a Christian?
Give me a second. Can you say that last part?
Yeah.
Okay.
If you elect somebody to represent you and your morals in government who's a Christian, why would you want him to rule from another stance other than Christianity? You would be then saying that other stance is more moral than his. So why would you be a Christian to begin with?
I mean, being a Christian is kind of, personally, it's more of a comfort for me,
Okay.
knowing that there's a higher power, a creator.
But it doesn't inform your morals?
Where my morals come from is kind of a collective of like what you were talking with FTFE yesterday, a collective of experiences, and I do lean.
So Christianity is purely cosmetic for you?
I tend to hope it's not, but
I mean, it sounds like it's purely cosmetic, and you're getting your moral information from intuition. Like, oh, this feels good, this doesn't feel good. But Christian ethics come from the teachings and dogmas of Jesus Christ, right? The laid foundations of Jesus Christ. And if you move against those, you're moving into antichrist territory, right? You're being antichrist. So, you can't like pick and choose Christian ethics, right?
That's a fair assessment. Man, all right, I gotta concede.
Okay.
This isn't really a topic that I discussed too
It's okay.
much, but it was a
No problem.
Andrew Wilson didn't just hold his own. Andrew Wilson dominated this entire exchange. Whether it was challenging the myth of secular neutrality, pointing out the double standards around ethics, or simply asking honest questions about moral consistency, Andrew Wilson led with logic and clarity. Even when his opponents tried to push back, Andrew Wilson stayed calm, confident, and grounded in his values. It's rare to see a debater make such a strong case without raising his voice, and Andrew Wilson did it twice in a row. Total obliteration.